Bela Kiss was a Hungarian serial killer. He is believed to have at least 23 victims of young women and 1 man, and tried to pickle their bodies in a large drum that he kept on his property. When he was young, Kiss had a possible incestuous relationship with his mother. He was a tinsmith and amateur astrologer, and was said to be fond of occult practices. Kiss was married twice and had no children. In 1912, he hired a maid after his wife allegedly left him for another man. Soon after working with him, his maid discovered that he had correspondence with several women, usually through advertisements he placed in newspapers, offering his services as a marriage broker or fortune teller, and sometimes brought the woman to his home individually. He described himself as a lonely widower looking for a female companion. His maid had little contact with the woman. Kiss was never close with his neighbors, although they said they liked him a lot. Townspeople also noticed that Kiss had collected several metal drums. When the city police questioned him about the drums, he told them that he had filled them with gasoline in preparation for rationing for the coming war. Though Kiss was a tinsmith, so it's not unusual in the slightest that he had metal barrels, as that was his job. Though I understand why the police had their suspicions, and they should have, as he would later use these barrels for nefarious purposes. When the First World War began in 1914, he was called for military service and left his house in his maid's care. Kiss rented his house, and the owner wanted to renovate the building, so he went to his neighbor, who informed him that Kiss went to war. Looking for material for decoration, the men went to a room next to Kiss's workshop, where they found several tin barrels stacked. I guess at this time it wasn't unusual for landlords and neighbors to wander around your apartment while you were gone to renovate it. Now I think it's illegal. The top of the upper barrel had been hacked with an axe, and when the men opened it, they were hit with a terrible stench. I mean, that's what they get for being nosy. They found a bag in the barrel. When they removed it, they found a woman's body sewn into it. I do not know why these men continued to search through the barrels. I would have left right after I noticed a stench. I have better things to do than look through barrels. Though I suppose people 100 years ago, before the internet, and I'm pretty sure that is also before the television, though I do not care enough to fact check that, I guess they got bored and didn't have better things to do than snoop through barrels they found. I mean, if I went without internet for that long, I would probably go insane enough to do things like that. They opened a second barrel, which the smell of a corpse also wafted from it, and blonde hair fell out. One body wasn't enough, so once they confirmed that there were 2, the men reported it to the police, who found a woman's body in each of the 7 barrels. A total of 24 bodies were found during the search of Kiss's house. The police informed the soldiers that they should immediately arrest Kiss while he was still alive. It was also possible that he was a prisoner of war. Unfortunately, his name was very common. I mean, the neighbor who discovered the bodies was also named Bela. There were thousands of Hungarian soldiers in the army, and they were unorganized. His maid was arrested and asked the post office to keep all possible letters for Kiss, in case he had an accomplice who could warn him. Side note, it is insane a tinsmith made enough money to hire a maid. These days you have to be very wealthy to hire employees. Can we go back to how the economy was 50 years ago? when working class people could actually afford a house. Now corporations are increasing prices for no reason other than they are greedy. The cost of production or employment doesn't increase. They just want to make more money. We need to riot. I am tired of inflation. I don't even have bills to pay. I am a freeloader who lives with my mother. The police initially suspected that his maid had something to do with the crime, especially since Kiss left his money in his will to her. She assured police that she knew nothing about the crime. I guess she didn't clean that one room. She showed them a locked room that Kiss told her to never enter. This was a different room than the ones the barrels were found in. The room was full of bookshelves. There was a desk with several letters with correspondence from Kiss with 74 women and a photo album. Many books discussed poisons or strangulation. The police investigated the letters where they noticed several oddities. The oldest letters date back to 1903 and revealed that Kiss had cheated on women, usually middle-aged women who were married. He placed advertisements in the matrimonial columns of several newspapers, mainly targeting women who had no relatives living nearby and knew no one who would quickly notice their disappearance. He enticed them and made them send money. Police also found old court documents showing two of his victims filed lawsuits because he took money from them. Both women disappeared and the cases were closed. Every woman who entered the house was strangled. Kiss coated their bodies in alcohol and sealed them in airtight metal drums. Police found that the bodies had puncture marks on their necks and blood dripping from their bodies, leading them to believe Kiss may have been a vampire. A few months later, police received a letter that Kiss was recovering in a Serbian hospital. However, they arrived at this hospital too late. Kiss ran away and left the body of another soldier in his bed. All the Hungarian police were informed there was a criminal on the run, but all the alleged findings that the police investigated were false. He was said to have been seen several times in the following years. There were various rumors about his true fates, including that he was imprisoned in Romania for robbery or he had passed of yellow fever in Turkey. In 1920, a French soldier reported another soldier named Hoffman, whom Kiss had mentioned in some of his letters. It was said he bragged about how good he was with a garrote, which is an iron wire used for strangulation. He matched Kiss's description, but fled before the police could catch up with him. The last known supposed sighting occurred in 1932 in New York. That year, homicide detective Henry Oswald was sure he saw Kiss exit the New York subway in Times Square, Manhattan. There were also rumors that Kiss lived in the city and worked as a janitor, although these could not be verified. When police went to question the guard, he had already left. His wife's lover, Paul Beccari, was the only man among the 24 recovered victims. It is not known why he preferred woman victims. Was he mad at all women after his wife left him? Homicide detectives claimed Bela Kiss attacked his wife and her secret lover in a jealous rage and disposed of their bodies in a manner he believed prevented later detection. The crime apparently triggered a latent mania, and Kiss spent the next 2 years frantically chasing lonely women, collecting several of their savings before strangling and sealing them inside makeshift burial chambers. In the spring of 1919, Kiss was seen on Margaret Bridge in Budapest. During the police investigation, it was revealed that Kiss changed his papers, faking his death on the battlefield and assumed the identity of a soldier who passed to escape. However, this information did not bring the detectives closer to the man. Because Kiss again evaded capture, it seems like it was a lot easier to hide from police than it is now. In 1932, the homicide detective on the case firmly believed that Kiss, who would be approaching 70, lived somewhere in New York. Unfortunately, he was prevented from pursuing Kiss by the crowds in Times Square and could only watch in helpless rage as the criminal he was pursuing vanished. In 1936, after the previous mentioned tip that he was a janitor working in an apartment building, the case went cold. What ultimately became of Bela Kiss, whether he was ever in New York, has remained an unsolved mystery for half a century. In Hungary, he is remembered as a fugitive. The final fate of Kiss and the exact number of victims are unknown. Adam Rayner is the only man in history to be classified as both a dwarf and a giant. At 18, Adam Rayner was barely 5 feet tall. At 50, he was nearly 8 feet tall. Adam Rayner was born in Austria in 1899 to parents who were both of average height. After the outbreak of World War I, he enlisted in the army, but his small size forced doctors to run series of tests to determine his fitness. Only 4 feet 6 inches tall, Rayner was later classified by doctors as a dwarf and unfit to be an effective soldier. The limit was 4'10". The only thing particularly unusual about Rayner's dwarfism compared to others was the size of his hands and feet. They were too large for his size. Despite his short stature, he wore a shoe size of 10 or 43 in European sizes. A year later, he grew another 2 inches and tried to join the army one more time, but was again rejected. Despite his height, he was still 2 inches too short. However, that would soon change. In 1920, Rayner was still well below average height. According to assessments, he was also very thin. At 21, when a person normally stops growing, most doctors and people throughout his life assumed that Rayner's height would remain the same for the rest of his life. But then something happened. Rayner not only grew another 2 inches, he began growing at an alarmingly accelerated rate with no signs of slowing down. Within a decade, when he turned 30, he was well over the 4'10" mark. He now stood 7 feet 2 inches tall. The doctors were baffled. They began to study him. In 1930, they began to suspect that he might have developed a specific tumor that caused an extreme case of acromegaly, a condition, in this case, a pituitary tumor that causes the face, hands, and feet to grow abnormally due to overproduction of growth hormones. As seen with Andre the Giant, symptoms of acromegaly include enlargement of the hands and legs, which doctors noticed in Rayner. Also, over time, Rayner's face became more square as his jaws and eyebrows stood out even more due to the disease. Due to the rapid growth, he also had problems with his spine, which curved more and more to the side as each massive growth spurt made him taller and taller. In 1931, they discovered that their assumption was correct. Rayner's pituitary gland tumor had been growing for more than 10 years. His doctors decided to operate to remove it. They were aware that the chances of success were slim, but the outcome was surprisingly positive. After some time had passed, Rayner went back to his doctors for another checkup. They were relieved to discover that his height had not increased or decreased suddenly. Wait, I am aware people grow, obviously, but why were they glad his height didn't decrease? Is this something that happens? Am I an idiot? He was still growing, though at a much slower rate, as evidenced by the fact that his spinal curvature was slightly worse. It also didn't seem to be slowing down. Sadly, this left to Adam Rayner's health issues continuing to decrease. His left ear began to go deaf, and his right eye started to go blind. Now a man reaching middle age, Rayner's spine curvature was now so bad that the discomfort frequently kept him in bed and prevented him from taking care of himself. He was physically able to, but with the discomfort of moving, it was the best decision for him to live out his final years in an Austrian nursing home where he passed in 1950. In the end, Adam Rayner passed away at the early age of 51. Adam Rayner is still the only person in history to be categorized as both a dwarf and a giant in one lifetime, standing a colossal 7 feet 8 inches tall, though some estimates put him at 7'10". Despite this, he is still over a foot shorter than the tallest person who ever lived, Robert Wadlow, who was less than an inch away from being 9 feet tall. For the majority of us, death is a fear, or at least something we don't want to think about, a dread that lurks somewhere in the future beyond comprehension, though some people find a certain morbid beauty in passing. This occurred in Paris in the late 1880s, following the discovery of a body of an unnamed young woman in the River Seine.
It's not Seine, it's not cyan, it's simply Seine.
Close to the Louvre Museum. The mortuary pathologist was so memorized, haunted, even enchanted by the girl's peaceful face that he commissioned a plaster mask of her. The girl's body was put on display at the public morgue, drawing thousands of citizens of Paris who wanted to see what appeared to be a profoundly tranquil expression on her face. Paris was intrigued with the weird and morbid. It can be determined that she was only 16 when she passed, despite the fact that her body had no suspicious markings. Several doctors at the time assumed she had been the cause of her own demise, though assumptions without any evidence can be harmfully inaccurate. The circumstances surrounding the passing of the unnamed teen are still a mystery. Like hundreds of thousands of people who were discovered past who never make the news, her eerily serene, soft smile was frequently reproduced around Paris. Her head became a focal point on mantelplaces and salon walls in the city over all of Europe, influencing literature and the arts long after her passing. I wonder if any of my European viewers have heard of her. I certainly have not. When a Norwegian manufacturer created the first CPR doll in the 1950s with the name CPR Annie, the plaster mask of the woman's face that was cast was used in CPR training programs all around the world. At the time, discarded sex workers' bodies were frequently pulled from the river, the Seine, allegedly almost every day, according to some. Unless other evidence was found, the Persian police decided to assume the cause was of their own doing. Many have also remarked that a drowning person could never have maintained such a calm expression on her face. Furthermore, the woman was discovered to be completely unharmed. Most historians who have studied this unresolved case have come to the conclusion that she was one of the many sex workers who passed due to self-inflicted causes rather than endure the misery of the underground life some women were forced to live. Perhaps it was acceptable back then to make the widely held presumption that any woman found deceased was a sex worker and her passing was the cause of her own doing. However, recent understandings that were not available at the time can simply be used to refute the simplified approach to the case. At 6:30 a.m. on December 1st, 1948, police were contacted when a man's body was found on the beach at Somerton Park in South Australia. The man was found lying in the sand across from a home for disabled children. He was lying on his back and his head against the seawall with his feet crossed. The man was believed to have passed in his sleep. An unlit cigarette was in the right collar of his jacket. A search of his pockets revealed an unused second-class train ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, a bus ticket from the city that may have not been used, narrow aluminum comb made in the United States, a half-empty pack of juicy fruit gum, Army Club cigarette pack containing 7 different brands of cigarettes, a quarter full box of Bryant matches. Witnesses said that on the evening of the previous day, they saw a person similar to this man lying on his back in the same place where he was found later. A couple who saw him around 7 p.m. said they saw him extend his right arm fully and then drop it limply. Another couple who saw him around 8 p.m. when the street lights were on said they did not see him move for half an hour, although he was visible, though they said they believed his position had changed during the time. Although they commented to each other that it was strange that he did not react to mosquitoes, they thought it was more likely that he was drunk or asleep and therefore did not investigate further. One of the witnesses told the police that he noticed a man watching the sleeping man from the top of the stairs leading to the beach. According to witnesses, the man was in the same position when police found it. Another witness came forward over a decade later and told police that he and 3 others saw a well-dressed man on Somerton Park Beach carrying another man on his shoulders the night before he was found. He was British in appearance and believed to be in his 40s. He was physically fit. He was 180 centimeters, or 5'11", had gray eyes, light brown or ginger hair with a little gray around his root, broad shoulders, and a narrow waist. His hands did not show anywhere that would suggest he was a physical laborer. His big and little toes came together in a wedge shape, like a dancer or someone who wore pointed shoes, and accentuated high calf muscles consistent with people who regularly wore boots or high heels or performed ballet. He was dressed in a white shirt, red, white, and blue tie, brown pants, socks and shoes, a brown knitted sweater, and a modern gray and brown double-breasted jacket, said to be by an American tailor. All tags had been removed from his clothing, and he had no hat, which was unusual for men in 1948, or wallet. He was clean-shaven and had no identification, leading the police to believe that he had inflicted this onto himself intentionally. I'm not happy. I have to censor myself to avoid demonetization. My dear YouTube, there are crime shows that have all these naughty crime words in them, yet they still have ads on TV and other streaming services. Finally, his dental records could not be matched to any known person. An autopsy was performed, and the pathologist estimated the time of passing to be around 2 a.m. December 1st. The autopsy reads, the heart was of a normal size and normal in every way. Small vessels not commonly observed in the brain were easily discernible with congestion. The esophagus was covered with whitening of superficial layers of mucus and a patch of ulceration in the middle of it. The stomach was deeply congested. There was no congestion in the second half of the small intestine. There was blood mixed with the food in his stomach. Both kidneys were congested, and the liver contained a great excess of blood in its vessels. The spleen was strikingly large, about 3 times normal size. There was destruction of the center of the liver revealed under the microscope. Acute hemorrhage, extensive injection of liver and spleen, and the congestion to the brain. The testing did not turn up any evidence of foreign substance in the body. Finally, the pathologist noticed, "I am quite convinced the passage could not have been natural," suggesting poison. He had a pastry found in his stomach, though it was not thought to be the cause, despite the fact that poisoning remained the leading theory. The coroner was unable to determine the man's identity, cause of death, or whether he was the same man, because no one had seen his face when he was last seen alive at Somerton Beach on the evening of November 30th. On December 10th, 1948, the body was embalmed after the police failed to secure a solid identification. The police claimed that this was the first time they had recognized the need for such action. Staff at Adelaide Railway Station found a brown suitcase on January 14th that had been checked into the station cloakroom after 11 a.m. and had its label removed the day before the man passed. The man discovered on the shore was thought to be the owner of the suitcase. 4 pairs of underwear, pajamas, shaving supplies, a pair of light brown pants with sand in the cuffs, an electrician screwdriver, a table knife that had been cut down to a short, sharp instrument, a pair of scissors with sharpened points, a small square of zinc that was likely used as a protective shield for the knife and scissors, and a stenciling brush similar to those used by third officers on merchant ships were all found. The suitcase was also threaded with an unusual material that was not made in Australia. This was also the material found sewn to repair a rip on the pants he was wearing. The name T. Keene with an E could be found on the tie and laundry bag. And Keene without an E could be found on a shirt, along with 3 dry cleaning marks. The person who removed the clothing tags may have either overlooked these 3 items or may have done so on purpose, knowing that Keene was not the deceased man's name. Clothing was hard to come by at that time due to continued implementation of wartime rationing, although wearing name tags was a widespread habit. It was also normal to take the tags off previously owned items when purchasing used clothing. The absence of an extra pair of socks seemed peculiar. The police also discovered pencils and unused stationery. Search found no T. Keene was found missing in any English-speaking country. Additionally, unsuccessful was a nationwide distribution of the dry cleaning markings. The only information obtained from the luggage was that the coat inside had been made in the United States based on its front pocket and feather stitching. The fact that the coat was not imported suggests that the man either visited the United States or purchased it from a person of comparable stature who had. The man was assumed to be brought to Adelaide train station by an overnight train from either Melbourne, Sydney, or Port Augusta, according to police who checked incoming train records. They assumed he had showered and shaved at the nearby city baths, despite the fact that he had no ticket for the baths on him, before going back to the train station to buy a ticket for the 10:50 a.m. train to Henley Beach, which for whatever reason he did not board. He hurriedly left the station and boarded a city bus to Glen Lake before checking his luggage in the cloakroom at the station. Despite being referred to as city baths, the center was actually a public swimming pool. There was no evidence that the restrooms at the station were closed on the day he arrived. A different pathologist re-examined his body and made several additional discoveries. Instead of being in the condition expected of a man who had evidently been roaming around the city all day, the man's shoes were remarkably clean and appeared to have been recently polished. The lack of vomiting or convulsions, which are two primary physiological reactions to poison, was explained by the notion that the body may have been moved to Somerton Beach after the man passed away. According to this evidence, the chance that the man had passed elsewhere and had been dumped remained, according to pathologists, as none of the witnesses were able to absolutely identify the individual they saw on the previous night as the same person who was recovered the following morning. He emphasized that this was just supposition because everyone who saw it thought it was definitely the same person because the body was in the same spot and was in a recognizable position. Additionally, he did not discover any information about the man's identification. A University of Adelaide professor of pharmacy testified that certain drugs were exceedingly toxic in a relatively tiny oral dose and would be very challenging to identify even if they had been recognized initially. Both drugs were not made available to the general public until the 1980s, but he provided the pathologist with a piece of paper listing their names, noting that at the time they were quite easily attainable by the ordinary individual from a chemist without having to provide a justification for the purchase. The substances were subsequently identified as cardiac glucosides. He remarked that the only finding that did not correlate with the evidence found during the autopsy was the evidence of vomiting, saying without this he could not come to an honest conclusion. According to the professor, if the man had passed 7 hours after being last seen moving, it would indicate a likely undetectable dose. It has been suggested that the movement the witnesses reported seeing at 7 p.m. might have been the final convulsion before passing away. The pathologist remarked, "I would be prepared to find that he passed from poison, that the poison was probably a glucoside, and that it was not accidentally administered. But I cannot say whether it was administered by the deceased himself or by some other person." Despite these discoveries, he was unable to establish the unnamed man's cause of demise. He commented that all the difficulties would disappear if the body had been transported to its ultimate resting place. Following the inquest, a plaster cast of the man's head and shoulders was created. A tiny rolled up piece of paper was found in the man's pants pockets. This was from a book, which theme is to live life to the fullest with no regrets. This further suggested to investigators that he wanted to pass away and caused it. An anonymous man said he had found the rest of the book and gave it to investigators. A torn page from the end of the book, as if this case was not mysterious enough. There was cryptic writing. Before it was realized that the letters were a code, it was assumed that the words were in another language. It was attempted to be broken by code experts, but they were unsuccessful. Department of Defense cryptographers examined the handwritten writing in 1978 after receiving a request from ABC television journalist Stuart Littlemore. They claimed that because of the text's simplicity, containing insignificant symbols, which a clear meaning could not be concluded, and it might be meaningless output from a disturbed mind if it was an encoded message. They also claimed that it would be hard to make a suitable response if the text were an encrypted message. Retired police officer Jerry Feltus stated in a Sunday Mail piece in 2004, the concluding phrase could stand for the initials of "It's time to move to South Australia, Mosley Street." The detective team concluded that it was most likely that each letter in the code stood for the first letter in a word. A large survey of English literature comes to the conclusion that the letters were probably not written in code, but rather as a type of shorthand, and that it was unlikely that the original content would ever be known. Additionally, a phone number was also discovered in the back of the book. It belonged to a nurse named Jessica Ellen Jo Thompson, who lived on Mosley Street, only 400 meters or 1,300 feet north of where the man was discovered. When questioned by authorities, Thompson claimed that she did not know the man or the reason why he would have her phone number and chose her neighborhood as his final destination. She did, however, add that an unidentified man had attempted to see her at some point in late 1948 and had inquired about her through the neighbor next door. In 2002, later investigators claimed that she was either being evasive or just did not wish to talk about it, adding, thought Thompson knew who the Somerton man was. In a 2014 interview with 60 Minutes, Thompson's daughter, Kate, stated that she thought her mother knew the man.
65 years after a mystery man was found dead on Somerton Beach, Channel 9 can reveal explosive claims about who he was and how he died. Two women have opened up about a family secret, telling 60 Minutes about a possible affair between two spies that might have ended in murder.
There's always that fear that I've thought maybe she was responsible for his death.
Kate Thompson is referring to her mother, Jessica Thompson, a nurse long linked to the case.
She said to me she knew who he was, but she wasn't going to let that out of the bag.
The question now, were Jessica and Somerton man also lovers? Rachel Egan and her mother Roma say yes. Roma believes her late husband was the love child of Jessica and Somerton man, making Rachel the mystery man's granddaughter.
I'd rather find out the truth and deal with it and move on and have closure.
Rachel Egan is calling for the body of the Somerton man to be exhumed from the cemetery so that DNA testing can be undertaken.
Jessica Thompson asked police not to reveal her information to outside parties or retain a permanent record of her identity. In 1949, she felt it would be embarrassing and bad for her reputation to be associated with such a case. Though after passing, her family agreed to have her name released. When shown the plaster bust that was made of the man, Thompson appeared completely taken aback, to the point it was thought she might faint, though she said she did not recognize him. A romantic interest from her past was thought to be the man, though later he was found alive. Police reportedly looking into military records on December 5th after a man claimed to have shared a drink with someone who looked like the man on November 13th at a hotel in Glenelg. The mystery man allegedly showed a military pension certificate with the name Samuelson during their drinking session. In 1949, two witnesses recognized the body as that of a 63-year-old former woodcutter, Robert Walsh. A third person who saw the body but was unable to identify it at first eventually called the police and said it was Walsh. According to him, The variation in hair color was the reason he was unable to confirm this during the screening. Walsh had intended to return at Christmas, having departed many months earlier to purchase sheep in Queensland, though he never returned. Police were doubtful because they thought Walsh was too old to be the man. Although the condition of the man's hands suggested that he had not cut wood for at least 18 months, the police did claim that the body was suitable with that of a man who had been a woodcutter. However, hopes of a successful identification ended when one of the individuals who had previously positively identified the body as Walsh later withdrew her claim following a second viewing of the body, when the absence of a certain scar on the body, as well as the side of the dead man's legs, led her to realize the body was not Walsh's. 8 separate identifications have been made of the body by 1949, including 2 Darwin men who believed it to be a friend of theirs, as well as others who believed to be a Swedish man, a worker on a steamship, or a missing station employee. Due to the similarities between the laundry markings and those employed by various Melbourne dry cleaning businesses, authorities first assumed that the man was from Victoria. After the man's photo was published in Victoria, 28 people alleged to know his identity. Detectives from Victoria refuted all the allegations and claimed that other investigations showed it was improbable that he was from Victoria. It was initially believed that a seaman by the name of Tommy Reed was the man, but after some of his shipmates saw the body at the morgue, they said absolutely that the body was not Reed's. In 1953, police declared that they had received 251 potential identifications from people who said they had met or knew him. However, they claimed that the man's clothing was still the only clue of any value. The body of a 2-year-old son of a man who attempted to identify the Somerton man was discovered in a bag 12 miles from Somerton on June 6, 1949. His father was lying next to him unconscious. He was admitted to the hospital in a frail state from exposure, and after a physical examination he was moved to a mental facility. They had been missing for 4 days prior to their discovery. The police believe that the boy passed 24 hours before he was found. The man who found them claimed he had seen the location of the two in a dream the night before. His cause of death could not be determined by the coroner. However, it was thought to be from natural causes. After the event, the mother of the boy claimed she was threatened by a masked man who nearly ran her over in front of her house. The car stopped, and a man with a handkerchief over his face warned her to stay away from the police or else. In addition, a man with a similar appearance had been spotted prowling near the property. She thought this scenario might be connected to her husband's efforts to find the Somerton man, believing him to be Carl Thompson, who had worked with him in Renmark in 1939. The unknown Somerton man's body was buried in Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery in 1949, and the Salvation Army performed the ceremony. Flowers started showing up on the grave years after the burial. A woman observed leaving the cemetery was questioned by police, although she insisted she didn't know the man. The circumstances and historical setting of the deceased man's death have led to recurrent rumors that he was a spy. Spy agencies were interested in at least 2 locations that were close to Adelaide. In 2011, an Adelaide woman discovered a card in her father's belongings, which she gave to investigators. A World War I era American-issued identification for overseas sailors. They compared the ID photo to the Somerton man's. There were found to be physical similarities in the nose, lips, and eyes. The ear shapes of the two men were a very good match, and a mole on the face that was the same size and location in both photos served as a distinctive identifier. The ID card, which listed H.C. Reynolds' age as 18 and nationality as British, was issued in the United States in 1918. The US and UK National Archives searches for H.C. Reynolds related documents came up empty. Some independent experts think the Somerton man was not the owner of the ID card and it belonged to Horace Charles Reynolds, a Tasmanian who passed in 1953. In 2011, as the case gained new attention, a lawyer declined to exhume the body. His body's examination for DNA was authorized in 2019. The parties interested in further analysis agreed that they would pay the expenses. It is intended to compare his DNA with a potential granddaughter to determine if there's a match. In 2021, the exhumation was performed. Police reported that they were hopeful that DNA might be recovered as the body was in reasonable condition. According to the officials, if all is possible, DNA will be extracted from the bones. Tests will employ every method at modern disposal to try to bring closure to this enduring mystery. The technology available to us now is clearly light years ahead of the technologies available when the body was first discovered in the late 1940s. The identity of the man was revealed in 2022 to be Carl Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker born in the Melbourne district of Footscray on November 16, 1905. From hair strands discovered in the death mask created by police in the late 1940s, his DNA was identified. Matches were discovered for Webb's maternal and paternal distant cousins' descendants through investigative genetic genealogy. None of Webb's living relatives have actually met him, while there were initially no images of Webb before his passing. Later research revealed his probable appearance in a 1921 university football team picture, even though the picture did not specifically name Webb. In November 2020, images of Webb from the late 1920s that were discovered in a Webb family photo album were released. The ABC published photos of Webb's brother, Roy Webb, claiming they identified the Somerton man. These conclusions were not addressed by Forensic Science South Australia, who were conducting their own investigations. South Australia police said they were cautiously optimistic that this may provide a breakthrough despite not having confirmed the result. And that is where the story ends for now. I am honestly surprised. I thought it wouldn't have a conclusion, as a lot of unsolved true crime cases remain unsolved. If you could choose any case to be solved, which would you choose? Honestly, that was very long and I am exhausted. Though there is one more, thankfully short story that I would like to share with you. In what is now Nuremberg, Germany, a teenager was discovered wandering a public square on May 26, 1828. He was carrying an envelope holding two letters and was dressed in ragged attire. His first letter, which appeared to be written by an unnamed impoverished laborer who discovered and reared for the abandoned child, but was no longer able to care for him. It was addressed to the captain of a nearby military base and asked him to take the young boy into his care. A second letter dated 1812 that was not signed but appeared to be written by the boy's mother stated that his father had passed away and she was unable to care for him, and that he was being transferred to the military. The child, who was probably 16 or 17, was puzzled and was only able to write or read his name, Caspar Hauser. When questioned about his life, he initially could only reply that he had no idea of his identity apart from his name or origin. In addition to acting abnormally, Hauser lacked etiquette and preferred bread and water to meat and vegetables. To everyone's surprise, he seemed to have learned to read and write within a few weeks. Taking advantage of his newfound celebrity, he released his memoirs the following year, in which he claimed to have lived his whole life in a tiny dark room, sleeping on straw and being fed by oblivious strangers. As a result of Hauser's fame, several novels, magazine articles, movies, and even plays have been written about him. One of the strangest stories of the century is that of Caspar Hauser. As one article in the November 1874 issue of Overland Monthly and Out West magazine noted, for a quarter of a century it is doubtful any single individual in all of Europe was so much disgust or awoke so great an interest and curiosity, and hypotheses about his beginnings were widely covered in the newspapers on both sides of the country. There were supposedly many attempts on his life, the last one occurring 5 years after he was found, when he was tragically stabbed in 1833, adding mystery and tragedy to an already puzzling story. According to a persistent conspiracy myth, Hauser was actually the legitimate heir to the royal throne who had been hidden away for some sinister reason. Many argued that if the boy's existence wasn't a threat to a prominent person, then why would he have been treated so cruelly, and why would numerous assassins make attempts on the teenage boy? Probably because some people treat children cruelly and people try to assassinate celebrities. Although commonly accepted, this theory has been largely rejected as improbable by academics. The notion that a mystery involved of an unknown ancestry might actually be, though the mechanisms of a strong conspiracy. The legitimate successor to royalty was certainly not Hauser. In actuality, a great deal of tales and legends were widespread in the first part of the 19th century. The real truth of his identity is probably never going to be known because there is little reliable information and so many rumors that are presented as fact. Caspar Hauser was a liar, which is one thing that is quite well known about him. Numerous sources consistently consider that Hauser had a propensity for exaggeration and fantastic stories. When Hauser stated that he had lived his entire life alone as a prisoner in a cramped chamber without light, it is obvious that he was lying about his childhood. If this were the case, he would have been much more psychologically and physically weakened than when he was discovered. He very likely would have had rickets, a condition that weakens bones and is brought by a deficiency of vitamin D, which the body naturally creates when exposed to sunlight. The records include no reference to Hauser having malformed bones. Other issues with his story included the fact that at least one of the letters he had when he was discovered was a crude forgery and could not have been written when it was claimed. The army captain whom it was addressed to was not in Nuremberg in 1812 at the time the letter was said to be written, but he was there when it and Hauser first appeared a decade later, in 1828. Many people believe that Hauser staged the attacks and self-described attempted assassinations. At the time, this is far from being a thing of the past. Even today, individuals occasionally stage assaults, kidnappings, and even their own passings. Some sufferers Munchausen syndrome purposely hurt themselves in an effort to gain sympathy and attention. A strange teenager going by the name of Ray appeared at police station in Germany in 2011 and claimed to live alone in the forest for at least 5 years. It's also not uncommon for people to claim to have been abandoned and raised by animals. The healthy child claimed to be unaware of his identity and origins. He spoke English and German. Following a thorough investigation that lasted over a year, the police determined that Ray was actually a 21-year-old Dutchman who became tired of working in an office, and he decided to pull a massive hoax by posing as a semi-feral wild child. The topic of feral children is interesting to me. I would love to do a more in-depth research into it in the future. Casper claimed he was attacked 3 times, once in 1829 while he was alone in a cellar, and an unknown assailant cut his forehead superficially, and he was unable to describe what this person looked like. Once again in 1831 when he was alone and an unknown assailant shot him, though he later admitted he shot himself. And finally, in December 1833, while he was alone in public gardens, when an unknown assailant he could not describe stabbed him in the stomach. Numerous pieces of revealing evidence, such as what was and what wasn't discovered at the attack scene, contradict Hauser's assertion that he was attacked, leading many to believe that his death was suspicious. After the assault, a small pocketbook was discovered at Hauser's request and included a note that he said his attacker gave him. Astonishingly, the note indicated the attacker's hometown. It defies logic that an assassin would give his victim a handwritten note that would later be found and partially identify him. What wasn't discovered in the gardens where Hauser claimed he was attacked was an additional pair of footprints in the snow, is even more telling for his story. Hauser is thought to have stabbed himself, presumably for attention, and injured himself more greatly than he intended. If there are any more tragic stories you think I would be interested in, please let me know. Actually, just kidding. There is another fascinating person I just learned about that I need to tell y'all about. Real quick, guys. Tar was a French performer known for his peculiar eating habits and hunger. He could consume enormous amounts of meat, but he was always hungry. His parents were unable to support him, and as a teenager he was kicked out of the house. Before serving as the opening act for a traveling con man, he traveled around France with a group of sex workers and robbers. He consumed an entire basket's worth of apples, along with corks, stones, and live animals. He then took his act to Paris, where he worked as a street performer. On one occasion, he suffered with intestinal obstruction, which he was treated with laxatives. He could wrap the fold of his skin from his abdomen around his waist when he wasn't eating, as his skin hung so loosely. His stomach expanded like a huge balloon when he was full. The skin of his cheeks were wrinkled and hung loosely, and when stretched out he could hold 12 eggs or apples in his mouth. He sweat profusely. His body was hot to the touch, and he constantly had a foul body odor. When the War of the First Coalition began, Tar enlisted in the French Revolutionary Army, where his appetite could not be satisfied even by quadrupling the regular military ration. He consumed everything he could find from trash cans and gutters, yet his condition continued to deteriorate due to hunger. He underwent a series of medical tests to determine the extent of his ability to eat after being admitted to the hospital due to fatigue. During these tests, he was made to eat meals meant for 15 people at once, consume live cats, snakes, lizards, and puppies, and swallow eels without chewing. He was underweight despite his unusual diets, and aside from his eating patterns, he displayed no other symptoms of mental illness other than what was thought to be an emotionless attitude. The military used his unique abilities to swallow documents and sneak past army defenses, and then retrieve them from his stool after reaching his destination safely. On his first mission, Tar was kidnapped by Prussian forces, brutally beaten, and forced to a mock execution before being handed over to the French because he did not speak German. He consented to any treatment that may cure his appetite, as his experience was restricting to him. He was given laudanum, a combination of alcohol and opium. Seems like doctors at the time just prescribed patients with any drugs they had in the hope it would work. Also given tobacco tablets, wine vinegar, and soft-boiled eggs as treatment. He snuck out of the hospital to forage for waste in gutters, trash piles, and outside butcher shops. He also attempted to drink the blood of another hospital patient and eat the corpses in the hospital's mortuary. The procedure failed, and the physicians were unable to maintain him on a regulated diet. He was expelled from the hospital when it was believed he had eaten a 1-year-old toddler. 4 years later, he returned with severe tuberculosis, passing shortly afterwards following a lengthy bout of extreme diarrhea.